Well, hi everybody. It's 2 o'clock in the UK where we're holding this webinar from. So I think we're going to get going, and if other people are joining, that's fine, and you're very welcome. I can see you're joining from all over the place. Somebody from Zambia, somebody from Thailand, somebody from Barcelona. You're all so welcome to our very first masterclass in our advocacy season. This masterclass is on what I think is one of the most challenging areas for nurses, which is about using data and using it well. It's certainly been a challenge for me, but I've become a real data nerd in recent years because I've realized how powerful it is. And if you've been with us on previous webinars about state of the world's nursing and the strategic directions in nursing, you will have seen my enthusiasm for using the data that's in state of the world's nursing and how important it is that we are able to read it, understand it, and use it to make a case for investing in nursing. One of the challenges that we've discovered in nursing now, during the 3 years of the campaign, is that politicians easily overlook nurses and nursing. We are the biggest component in the workforce, and yet often nurses are just not in key places to inform decisions that are made about the health system, and often don't use the data that's available to justify being in those decisions. So one of the things we want to do with our season of advocacy is to give you a little push down that pathway, so that you too will become data nerds and understand that data is actually incredibly powerful and useful. And we should be asking for more of it and learning better how to interrogate it. Oh, there's Gwen Sherwood. I'm looking at the chat box here. Hello, everybody who's writing in the chat box. Alison, there's people here from all over the place, and Gwen Sherwood from North Carolina, whom I worked with there. Hi, Gwen. It's great to see you there. Erica from Argentina. We've got people from the UK, all over the UK, Moldova. So wonderful, just wonderful to see all of you here, and you're so welcome. If you do have questions for Alison as this session goes on, please do write them in the chat box and we will ask Alison. There's good time for question at the end here. We've got an hour for this masterclass. So today, it's my huge honor to be able to introduce to you Professor Alison Leary, a woman of whom I am in awe all the time. Alison is at the London South Bank University, which is has a special place in my heart as it runs the nurse practitioner program that I was initially involved in many years ago, and they've taken it on and run with it, and it's fabulous, fabulous now. And Alison is there. She primarily does research, but also does some teaching and supervision of PhD students. And Alison started her career as a scientist, like a pure scientist, not a nurse scientist. And so in some ways that sets her apart because she has a different kind of view about nursing, I think. And I first encountered Alison when I was working on health workforce projections for IntraHealth and for the US, USAID funded project. And somebody said to me, you need to read Alison Leary's work, and indeed I did. And Alison is absolutely the top person for modeling and has begun to do some very exciting work on looking at big data and associating big data on outcomes with inputs, with nursing inputs. So Alison has so many honours and is highly esteemed here in the UK and beyond. And in particular, I think in my world, was the person who pointed out that nurses are mission critical to safety. And that to me was a big revelation at the time. And we are absolutely delighted, humbled that Alison, you would agree to come and do this masterclass for us. So thank you so very much. And I'm going to hand over the floor to you now.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks for inviting me to do this. I am quite passionate about data. So the data that the examples I'm going to show are from the UK, but the kind of data is probably available in many different places. So it's things like hospital statistics, vital signs data, some outcomes data for patients. And I thought I'd really just have a look at some of the challenges as well that nurses face when they're really talking about data. So this is not so much a methods sort of masterclass because we've only got half an hour. It's more about the potential for using data and why we need to be around the table when a lot of these things are actually kind of formed. So I'm going to try and move my slides on. So in the English NHS, we collect a huge amount of data, a lot of it's not used. So there are things like that they're mostly for performance, and actually I've seen this in quite a few health systems around the world. Really what we should be looking at is outcomes data, what affects patients. Nurses spend a huge amount of time collecting data that's never used, sort of redundant data. And this is why nursing needs to be around the table really when we think about data, because data can tell us lots of really important things. So I think this is the first ever odds chart. It's experiments with anaesthetics, I think, because data, the value of data quite often for nursing is in things like trends rather than just measuring one thing. And nursing has changed an awful lot. It's a much more complex world than it was sort of 20 or 30 years ago. But I find it's really interesting when I talk to people, the assumptions they make about nursing are quite kind of old-fashioned, about task delivery, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And also nursing happens everywhere. So it happens in hospitals where people think about data collection, but also in the community, mental health settings, and across the world, rural locations, urban locations. You know, there's a huge amount of diversity in nursing practice, and it's really important we start to capture some of that, because I think that has an effect on patients. A lot of the work we do is what kind of trendily known a few years ago as big data. So high volume data, when you look for patterns in it. And what that can do is it can give you insight into a lot of the issues that we face. So things like staffing, for example. And we've done some work on that. And the question we would generally ask is, can all this routinely collected data that most systems capture, how good is it? And can you use it for nursing? So when we think about nursing, we've got some challenges here. So we're not very good at defining what we do. We're what we call a plastic workforce. Nurses will do anything. They don't put boundaries around their work. That makes it really difficult if you're a modeler. It's complex, non-linear work. So a lot of things about nursing, it's always assumed to be tasks done one after the other, and nursing isn't like that at all. Nurses do many different things at once, and the cognitive load of nursing is very high, which is why it's a safety critical profession. The demand for nursing is very rarely ever modelled. So a lot of things like workforce are modelled from the supply side. How many people can we afford? Or how many people can we train? Not how many people do we actually need? And nurses themselves are really reluctant to articulate their contribution or claim their work. They'll usually give the credit for nursing to somebody else. And if you're trying to measure stuff, that makes it really difficult. So alongside the misperceptions of nursing, nurses actually feed some of these misperceptions by failing to claim what is theirs. And we see it quite a lot. So, and if you observe nurses the way I do, you'll see nurses give away their contribution. You know, they'll give it away to different groups of people. They say it was nothing. You know, they're very modest people. But actually, that means in terms of nursing data, nursing isn't seen, isn't very visible, and that can cause some problems. So some of the false assumptions about nursing, being a modeler, we always start with assumptions, and these are some of the common assumptions that we would kind of have to tackle if we were doing some modelling with some data. So the one about nursing being linear. So nursing is seen by lots of people that are not nurses, and in fact some nurse leaders, as a series of tasks, as technical work is tasks, and the tasks are done one after the other. But actually, nursing isn't like that. A lot of nursing, I'd say one of the principal USPs, the unique selling points of nursing, is the management of risk for patients. Like any other safety critical professional, they're managing risk, and they're constantly vigilant to changing situations. So it's not just the delivery of tasks. We've seen the delivery of tasks crop up in certainly in this country, in England, with things like competency. If you're technically competent to do a task, then it's okay. And actually, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So one of them is the delegation of vital signs to workers that are not registered nurses, who can adequately and competently collect the data, but can't always interpret the data. So that's one of the examples. And this follows on from like nursing be the application of task-based skill set, and nurses not being particularly decision makers. And nurses make decisions all the time, every day, whether to act, not to act, and what to do. There's also an assumption nursing can be measured very easily with things like time and motion studies. So, this work takes X amount of time. Now, that sort of stuff works really, really well in what we call service industries or manufacturing, but it doesn't work very well in complex safety critical industries. But quite often, a lot of the data that you might see around nursing, particularly around staffing, is based on this kind of work. And what it typically does is underestimate workload. So this is quite often policymakers assuming nursing is a service industry. It's the same as perhaps hospitality or retail or manufacturing, but actually it isn't. There is a lack of understanding of the complexity of the work of nursing. So this is one of the things we try and address through data. And that things like caseloads or numbers of patients equal workload, but they don't, because complexity comes in here. So it depends how complex the needs are of those patients and whether you can say that's actually reflective of workload. And there's also the assumption that all work is completed in the time allocated. And we know from many studies around the world that nurses work way over the hours that they are paid for. There's also an invisibility in policy. And I think a lot of these assumptions lead to that invisibility of policy. And it is very good to see people like Barbara pushing to get nursing much more visible. It is the largest part of the workforce and it needs to be seen. So when we think about data, there's a lot of data collected, but data is, I quite like this sort of tree really. It's you have to turn data into wisdom. Without interpretation, it isn't much use. So what we typically see in performance data, so how it's literally just measures of things without very much interpretation. So you might see, things like bed days used or the amount of pressure ulcers or something like that, but without much interpretation. So quite often in a lot of health systems, I think the data part really is in the first two triangles here, the first two parts of that pyramid. So what we try to do, and what people like me try to do, is try and turn that information into knowledge and eventually to wisdom, so that people can make better decisions with their data. So some things to think about here. So there's lots of data in nursing. We've got staffing data, nursing assessment, things about the environment, things about time, patient feedback, incident reporting. That's one we use quite a lot. And that seems to be quite common, particularly in areas like Europe, Australia, and the USA. But also things like safety data. One of the issues around safety, and I'm often asked about things like safe staffing, is nurses can't decide collectively what safety is. And that makes it really difficult then to think about what kind of data we could collect. So we kind of use proxies for that. Qualitative and quantitative data is valid, and I think there's quite a lot of focus. I mostly use quantitative data because we're mathematicians, but qualitative data is just as important, because when you model the real world, you need to know that your maths works in the real world. So we'd use qualitative and quantitative data, and a lot of data collected by nurses isn't used by nurses, and it isn't used by anybody else. And this is kind of a situation where we're spending a lot of effort collecting data, but then it isn't used. And partly it's because of things like EHRs, electronic health record systems, very rarely designed by nurses, very rarely designed by the sort of largest part of the workforce. So the data they collect isn't always sensitive. So it's important to understand complexity if you're going to look at nursing data. So this is just, this represents a phone call by a specialist nurse. I've got some stuff on specialist nursing because that's a group that we work with quite a lot. So if you looked at the data that would be collected in EHR, it would say one phone call. But actually what we can see is at least 6 interventions. And it wouldn't be, these interventions wouldn't be collected. So we have bespoke systems to collect this sort of data.
I think we've lost Alison. For the moment. Hannah, can you confirm we've lost Alison for the minute?
Yeah, I think she'll just be going out and then come back in again.
Okay. Yeah. It's a connection problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Okay. So yes, everybody, we've lost Alison for the minute. I think it's it seems an internet connection problem. So I think she's going to go off. It looks like she's gone off and she'll be coming back in again. So be thinking about the sorts of questions that you might like to ask Alison when she comes back, which we devoutly hope she will any second. What it made me think about was the data in State of the World's Nursing, and the sorts of questions we should be asking of that data. You know, what are the critical things? So be thinking about the data you have for your country, and you know what you know about some of the issues that she's put up in your country. There we have one question. It'd be good to know what constitutes data in qualitative. Yes, that's a good question, Carolyn Hill. And once we get Alison back, I will be able to ask her that. It looks like she's not yet tuned in, Hannah. I don't think so.
No, she's not. I'm just going to send her another link.
Okay, great. Okay. The other thing that Alison raised that I think is also interesting is looking at new ways of measuring nursing. And I was thinking that a lot of the issues that Alison's been talking about are things we've been interested in for a long time in nursing, haven't we? How to describe it, and what it really means, and how the sum of the whole is greater than its parts, isn't it? Because You know, a nurse, a district nurse who goes into a house may only be seen to maybe be, you know, doing vital signs and overseeing care, but actually at the same time is actually doing a whole host of other things, looking at the housing, looking at the heating, looking at the relatives, you know, engaging with people. So it's how you measure that complexity, I think. And not only measure it, but describe it. She's back. Yay!
Oh, sorry. For some reason, the internet just completely failed. I had a power failure.
Oh, no. Alison. Well, I started talking a bit about some of the sort of things I see from what you're presenting, and we've got a few questions coming in. So let's let you finish, and then we'll move to the questions after that.
So I'll just go quite quickly. These are just examples. So this one is really about the benefits of nurses proactively. So this was in lung cancer, but it could be in district nursing, it could be in the managed care in hospitals, it could be anywhere really. And it's really to show that it is possible to show that nurses have a direct impact on outcomes. So this is 110,000 lung cancer patients over 5 years in the UK. And essentially having a specialist nurse proactively manage your care pre-diagnosis and during diagnosis means you are more likely to survive for a year.
Alison, is it possible to make that full screen?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Just because it's easier to see. And I do think that's a really important slide, actually.
Yeah, I mean, the papers for this have been published now if people want to see them. So that, I mean, that's the thing about proactive case management. So nurses proactively managing care, being vigilant, picking up on issues and dealing with them. In the case of people with lung cancer, actually advocating them to get treatment for their cancer is actually really important. And there are 3 papers in lung cancer and thorax which describe this data set. So this is another specialism, and in England we have something called the 18-week target. And what we saw with the introduction of specialist nursing, and so proactive case management again, was that more people could be treated within target with better outcomes. So those were specialist nurses, and it was actually the pharmaceutical industry that invested in these roles. So you know, you can see this kind of over and over again, and the links to the papers are on the bottom now. Looking at risk. So one of the things we're really interested in is looking at risk. So this is routinely collected hospital data, and this is something that a lot of people wouldn't bother looking at. This is the risk of you not having your bowels open for 5 days or more, which actually we know is associated with higher morbidity. You know, there are consequences to not having your bowels open. So this is one hospital who are a great group of people actually who really, really wanted to look at the way things were where they were. And so we were able to look at the risks of this. And the colours, the RAG ratings are arbitrary. I'm not a big fan of RAG ratings. I think people should look at numbers, not colours, because you can get colour blindness with RAG rating. But essentially what this hospital then were able to do when we found this pattern was they were able to go and look what was going on in those areas and why this was not happening. So we could see the pattern, and then the clinicians could then go and ask the questions about why people weren't having their bowels open. Quite often it was actually about prescribing. So they were able to then improve the outcomes for the patients in terms of things like, you know, bowel management, which is actually quite important. Same with falls, same with pressure ulcers. So one of the things about we looked at when people reported pressure ulcers and falls. So you kind of see a pattern. So this is not when they happen, but when people actually report them into an incident reporting system. And people's patterns and behaviours can be really, really helpful. So in things like pressure ulcers, it was after the washes, so it was at 10 o'clock in the morning. But falls, it was around, there was a peak at 5 in the morning and then another peak around sort of 11 in the morning. And the instant reporting system that was used in this organisation is one called Datix, and you can type in words what happened. So we were able to mine this, and people kind of knew that people felt, falls were quite common at 5 in the morning. So they improved their staffing around them to help with reduction in falls. But also from the text, it was possible to see that the falls often happened in the bathroom. And one of the reasons seemed to be that the place where the toilet paper was behind where you would naturally reach for it. So this trust moved the toilet roll holders, I still can't get over this, 70 centimetres forwards, and the falls dropped by 50%. So, I just think that's amazing. So we looked at the pattern, and then they did a QI project to improve outcomes for patients. And then what we can see from, so total events, the y-axis on here is how many incidents happened. And the bottom, the x-axis, is nurses in post. And what you can see is a sort of pattern emerging. That the more nurses you get, the more whole-time equivalent registered nurses you get, the more incidents tend to be reported until you get to this sweet spot where the incidents actually drop. So we hypothesize that this is the point where, that's where you've got better staffing and you're not getting so many incidents. You can see when staffing isn't very good, people don't tend to report incidents, and this is a pattern we find again and again in many different organisations actually. So if staffing's poor, people will only not tend to report incidents, or they'll only report the really big stuff. But if staffing's good, they'll report more minor incidents and near misses, which is good for safety culture, until you get to a point where the incidents really kind of drop. And you can see this kind of thing on outcomes too. So this is the management of nausea and vomiting in an ward, and this pattern emerges. So this is what we call a sigmoid function. That nice S-shaped curve is something you kind of want to see in modelling. It's a repeating pattern, which is great. So what we see here is along the bottom is the whole-time equivalent registered nurses, and the top is the incidence of people experiencing nausea from the KPI, from the OBS charts. And again, what we see is there's between the two lines is kind of the sweet spot. That's where the nursing really matters. That's where you see it start to decline. If you add more nurses, it probably won't make any difference past that second line. But up to that second line is where your kind of optimum staffing is if you want to manage that particular outcome. So you can get a lot from this kind of data. And this is just routinely collected data. This isn't research data. This is the stuff that most hospitals in most countries that have things like EHR will be collecting, or vital signs packages will be collecting. Then you can use that kind of data then to see what's driving demand. So understanding demand isn't something we do particularly well in healthcare. So what you can do is then start to map out the strength of these relationships and who's having the impact on what. So this is the kind of things that we might see. So the fact that healthcare is quite complex, and particularly the management of things like long-term conditions or the management of chronic illness is quite tricky because lots of people are involved, and the concept is very complex. But we can start to see the strength of relationships from this kind of data, which tells you maybe where you want more resources, or maybe where people could be doing something different. And it allows people to have a conversation, because then you're looking at more than one dimension, not just what task is delivered, but who's doing what, where they're doing it, what outcome does it have, what effect does it have on patients, most importantly. So that's kind of where you can go with this kind of work. But there is a big elephant in the room, and that's the quality of data. So this data is from some data that we collected from some district nurses, so nurses that work in the community setting, and they are proactive case managers. It's an advanced practice role, really, and we collected this collected just where the care was delivered, not what the care was. We collected what the care was on top of this. But when we looked at their data, it was around the data that's routinely collected in their EHR. It only recorded about 15% of their work. So we went in and collected it like much more individually. But this is the problem. In nursing, we have a really big issue with the quality of data. A lot of EHR systems don't collect nursing data particularly well. They don't collect that complexity of work particularly well. They don't collect risk being managed. They tend just to collect what interventions or tasks are being delivered. And that means that it's kind of important to understand the limitation of that if people are thinking about using it for things like workforce planning or as a proxy for demand, because it can make it really tricky. I've seen lots of people build staffing models based on this data, and it really doesn't help. It really puts people at quite a big disadvantage. So what we need, and why nurses need to be involved in this, and why I'm really passionate about it, is we have something in computer science called garbage in, garbage out. So you can have really bad data and a good model for things like workforce planning, but you get terrible results, and that gives people poor decision making. When you've got good data and a good model and you get good results, and that can give you insight, that can give you real insight, but you'll only get that really good model and that really good data if the people that are involved in the work, so if you've ever read Eric Holnagle, Work as Imagined versus Work as Done, it'll only be any good if people are actually involved in that work. So nurses really need to be around the table when it comes to things like informatics. I know lots of people think that it's not particularly relevant to their work, but it's actually really, really important. So this is where you come in. You don't have to be a data scientist, you don't have to be a mathematician or a statistician or any of those things. You have to bring your real world knowledge to work with, I guess, people like me and vendors and people that deploy data collection systems, so that your data is adequately captured so that you can use it to do those things. So we've got that challenge. It doesn't start with consumers. Quite often a lot of EHRs are just deployed and designed by people that are not nurses. And a lot of data collection tools have very little underpinning research or what we call an ontology, a structure of knowledge for nursing. So one of the biggest incident reporting systems, and one that we actually utilise quite a lot, which is Datix, which is some of the data that I've shown you, that has very little in terms of nursing in it. So the common classification system for Datix doesn't include things like work left undone. That's really important for nursing, because nurses do leave a lot of work undone. The data is siloed, so in pretty much every organisation I've ever seen in the world, there is very little integration of data. So people use lots of different systems to get lots of different data, and bringing it all together is really important, because that's how you get insight. And little data is collected about what we call the negative space, so things like staffing, harm, safety, and the work left undone. A lot of that's been completely left out of a lot of these systems, the EHRs. So this is just an example from England about not being around the table. So a couple of years ago, there was a review in England. It's called the Carter Review, and this was how they do work out staffing data. So you can see it's a pretty simple piece of arithmetic, which kind of makes me a little bit ill. So you can look at things like care hours per patient, but you have to realise these things are really, really limited, and this is generally because nurses are not around the table. So this is why I think what you guys are doing is really important. What things like Nursing Now are really important, because nursing policy, I think, in lots of places is an evidence-free zone. A lot of people just sort of assume they know what nurses do, and it's really funny because I did start my career as an engineer and a scientist, and no one ever says to me they know about engineering and science because their dad was an engineer. I get it in nursing all the time. You know, my aunt was a nurse. I know what I know about nursing. I find that incredible, but there you go. So that's one of the things that I think we really need to do. However you can influence policy, however you can have your voice heard, is advocacy for your patients, and I think it's so important to do that. So that's, I think, about it from me. That's my first computer there, ZX Spectrum, a long time ago, and that's my email address if anybody has any questions or wants these slides or would like any of the papers. So thank you very much.
Alison, thank you. If I could, I'd be giving you a big round of applause. Thank you so much. You really make it so alive, the whole issue of data, which I believe it is. I mean, I think you really illustrate that and bring the excitement to it, because I think it is excitement, you know, to discover those sweet spots, to discover the questions we should be asking when we see data, and, you know, how we can't always be fooled into accepting that what they're telling us in numbers is true necessarily. You know, you have to go beyond that.
Yeah.
So we've had a few questions in the chat box. Yes, somebody says, brilliant as always, Alison. Yes, I quite agree. So please put your questions in the chat box if you haven't already. We have got a couple, and I've got a couple too. So one of mine and one of Carolyn Hill's is also about what constitutes data in qualitative research. And I was thinking about that when you actually put something up that said the way that you interpreted the data, I think, had been influenced by the accounts, the written accounts of what happened. So it wasn't only the number, it was that. Yeah. And I wondered if that was some way of using qualitative data. But yes, what constitutes that?
Yeah, I mean, the qualitative data that we would use is people's accounts. We use high volume, so the instant reporting systems like Datix and text. You can mine text the way you can mine numbers, and we do quite a lot of text mining. Is there
software programs that do that? Yeah.
You have to train them.
Okay.
So you can use things like machine learning to train software programs to understand kind of the. So one of the things in Datix, one of the things in instant reporting system is profanity. So people swear in. So that kind of you know, it's a bit. It actually tells us something, you know, it tells you people are frustrated.
Yeah.
And in other industries, we take that really seriously. So if we were working in engineering, if we were working in the nuclear industry, and people were reporting incidents and swearing into the instant reporting system, that would be a red flag.
Right. Yeah.
You know? And it's the same way you can pick out patterns in text as well. And also, there's also you know, you can do this, and then you go back to people. So a lot of modelling is iterative. You look at the data, you mine the data, you go and collect the data, and then you take it back to people, and you say, "What do you think?" And then go, yeah, that is what we find, or no, that's not our experience at all. And that's one of the ways that you increase the integrity of the stuff that you're doing. So the thing about the falls at 5 a.m, we could have just said, oh yeah, people fall at 5 a.m, and they report it at 10 in the morning. There you go, there are your findings. But it's only by going and talking to people and looking at the text do you find actually the falls happen in the toilet, and the falls happen because people are reaching behind to get toilet paper.
That was so interesting, wasn't it?
I never thought that.
No.
There's a lot of that. You'll find, particularly in big organisations, you'll find the same things happening again. Big organisations and lots of data give us the opportunity to look at patterns.
Yeah. Somebody, let me just see who it is now. Nicola Braid has written that she's been reflecting on piloting a workforce planning tool in an inpatient setting, and that it was very task focused and didn't take into account things like decision making. And I reckon that's where the really clever research is, isn't it? It seems to me, because you can watch what people do, but you have to marry that up with how they're doing it, really.
Yeah. So you have to understand about risk, and so we do quite a lot of workforce modelling for people now, and a lot of it is, so it's quite labour intensive, and it also we would tend to look at the complexity of the patients, because the complexity of the patients drives workload, not the demand for tasks.
Right.
And there are also things like rookie factor. So inexperienced workers take longer and are less able to make decisions, or good decisions anyway. So you have to kind of factor those things in. So task-based systems assume everybody is at the same level of technical competence, and they assume nothing else goes on apart from those tasks.
Right.
And nothing isn't like that. I mean, we know that. So if you look at people like Lisbeth Fagerström's work on Rafaela in Scandinavia, that's a very good way of capturing that. Or trend care type systems from New Zealand and in the places like Singapore, they capture more of that work.
Yes, yeah, that's interesting, and kind of links with the question that somebody's anonymously sent us, saying that some data might seem to be stating the obvious. For example, if you've got more high ratio of staff, then patient care would increase, kind of thing. So this person's asking for your views on a common sense approach. What do you think? Have you often been surprised by what you found?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things around ratios is that ratios are just a fail-safe. They're not really an answer to a staffing model.
Right.
So, which is quite interesting, because I think there's some evidence now that the ratios have perhaps got some limitations on, or it might be that the ratios are not right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a common sense approach is one of the things that I find quite interesting is when you speak to people in leadership positions, they haven't really spoken to their staff about demand. And I find that quite interesting, because you can build really good models for the workforce. Unless you actually speak to the people that are, subjected to them, you won't really know if they're working. So I find it quite interesting that, I think it was Julian Legrand wrote a book about knights and knaves in healthcare, and how the workforce is assumed to be a knave. It's always trying to get one over on the management. But actually, most people are not like that at all. Most people want to do a good job. They're not just after an easy time. And I find in all the safety critical industries that are working, I think the frontline workforce and leadership in healthcare, the trust gap is the biggest.
That's interesting.
So if air traffic controllers go and say, we're running a high risk here, people will tend to listen to them. But if nurses do it, just do more.
And why do you think that is? Why is it something about that people don't consider nursing to be scientific?
I think it's not just nurses as well. I think there's a lot of issues. I think the rise of managerialism in healthcare hasn't helped. So it's been more about efficiency,
right?
Task delivery, efficiency.
Yeah.
So if you take the air traffic controller analogy further, it's more about how many planes take off, not how many land safely.
Yes.
Which I find quite
true. Yeah.
quite concerning.
Which as a passenger you might think was more important. Yeah.
So I mean, that's it. It's a competing priority for the people that run healthcare services. It's quite often about delivery of service and volume of delivery and efficiency of delivery, whereas for patients it's about outcomes.
Yeah.
And also for staff it's about outcomes. Staff generally want to do a good job.
Yeah.
And so we've got this tension between the two things, I think, about the fiscal constraints, the efficiency issues, and then delivery of service.
And problem, I think the problem is quite often it's not either or is it? It's both and all the time. So you want a good outcome, but you also want your process of care to be kind and caring for you. And then you also got to bear in mind that, that you need to stay within a budget, as it were. So you've kind of got this whole thing going on at the same time, which is what you said at the beginning, that nurses are often juggling lots of things in their heads, but they don't articulate them. They don't, as a
So, I think, as you know, I feel quite passionately about articulating nursing as a safety critical profession.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think that people haven't really understood that when nursing isn't there, really awful things happen.
Absolutely. And people, yes, Nigel Crisp actually often says, it's very simple. No nurses, no healthcare. And actually it is that simple. It's just that we don't say it. And I've started to say a lot more that nursing is a best buy in healthcare, because I think it is all of these things, it's because you get better outcomes, you get better care, and you actually get care if you have more nurses. So, but you
get better and safer care if you have more registered nurses.
Yeah, that's it.
But it's a hard sell in a cash constrained system.
Yes, it is. We've got a question from Ariana, who's one of our nurses from Indonesia, one who won a prize, I think, recently, if I remember rightly, Ariana, certainly has engaged with us several times. She says, thank you for your inspiring presentation. How do you think we could optimize EHRs, electronic health records, isn't it, to record nurses' work and use the data as evidence for our advocacy? I think that's an interesting question, isn't it?
It's a really good question.
Yeah.
Really good question. So one of the things that we could do is work with the vendors, the people that build EHR.
Good point.
There are sorts of, quite often nurses seem to get involved in EHR right at the very end when it's being delivered to them. So more organisations now have sort of chief informatics nursing officers and people like that. And it's important to engage with them so they can engage with vendors in choosing these systems. As a profession, we should not be tolerating the purchasing of systems that don't capture our work.
Right.
Ultimately. But ideally, a lot of the vendors are quite open to making changes. They want better systems, it sells better. So there are nursing taxonomies and ontologies out there that can be used, and I think working with vendors locally, they're quite happy to adapt systems, I've found, so that the data collection's better and more useful. So speaking to your senior nursing leadership about EHR systems, I think is a good first step.
That's a really good idea. And of course, you did, raise this important point that if we're not involved in the design of these things, we're not going to have any influence. So getting involved in design it should be yet another place where we see nurses, shouldn't it?
Yeah, nurses should be leading.
Yeah.
Nurses are the biggest users of EHR.
Yeah, and yet we don't. We've got some questions from people who are like you, clearly scientists. One of them has asked a question that I do not understand. And I'm just going to ask if you have any comments on it. Could this data be also used for statistical significance of refutability of the null hypothesis? Don't feel you have to answer that. But Anthony Jemmett, who is a scientist, has asked us this.
Let me just find the question.
It's in the Q&A section.
Could this data be used for reliability of the null hypothesis? Is that null hypothermia? I've never heard of null hypothermia. No,
null hypothesis. The refutability of the null hypothesis.
Yes, if you've got a hypothesis you want to test, you could absolutely. That's what we do mostly. We've written quite a lot of papers on that. So one of the ones that you could use was we did some work with a mental health organisation who wanted to look at staffing. Many people do, and the effect on outcomes for patients. And they also hypothesised better staffing was safer for staff.
Right.
And yeah, that is what we found. Yeah, I mean, you can absolutely do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay, Anthony, we've answered that question. Or Alison, I should say. I shouldn't use the royal we in this case. But I think it moves on to that question by Simone Belli, who says, I think we have a problem with statistics skills in our universities. What do you think about this? And a number of people have asked about how do you help nurses to become better at this? And is there a good practice at LSBU about teaching this to nurses? Because I think it might revolutionize the profession if we all got much better at this.
So yeah, I mean, there's loads of statistics courses. I mean, you can work on a lot of the work that we do is sort of the big data stuff. So we tend to use pattern recognition work and things like regression.
Right.
The lung cancer work was regression. So you can do that. But the thing is, do you need to? That's what I would ask you. Do you need to be a statistician to do this? No, you don't. You need to come up with the questions and then take them to a statistician. Trying to be an expert in everything. Some of this maths is quite hard.
Yes.
Trying to be an expert in everything is kind of like, really, really difficult. And actually, this is the point of science. Science is a collaborative kind of activity. So in the universities that you might work with or some healthcare organisations, you will find statisticians. You will find people that can do this stuff. But what they won't have is your insight and your questions.
Right. So it's working together, partnerships.
Yeah, I would work together with others on it. And I work with a bunch of like much younger people than me who are much better at this than me now.
These young people, my goodness, what are they like?
Much more technically able than I am.
Dear.
Who are able to write much better code, interpret things, much better at things like natural language processing. They work on it all the time. They're really good at it. Yeah. So I tend to work with them because, I think hopefully they get some insight from me on a lot of these issues. But also, they are better, and why not use expertise around you? So
it's a good point. It's so true, Alison, and we need to think of ourselves in a community of scientists, don't we?
Exactly. Nursing is part of a community of scientists. I really believe that. Nursing is a STEM subject. Nurses are part of a community of scientists, and like all the scientists, we collaborate with each other to come up with answers.
Yeah, I think that's right. Anthony Gemmett, who posted that wonderful question about the null hypothesis, has said he's a community matron in mental health. So yay, we do have a scientific community in nursing. Yay, yes. Go Anthony. Thank you so much. So yes, I wanted to ask you a question myself, really, about state of the world's nursing, which I'm imagining you've seen at some point. It's got a lot of workforce data in, and they're now developing the strategic directions on nursing midwifery from it. I wondered what you, having looked at that workforce data, which is now available, do you have any sort of advice for us as a sort of community of nurse scientists about how we should be interrogating it in our various locations around the world, in our country, because you can now get your own country data. So what sort of things should we be looking at and asking for when we look at it?
So whenever anyone presents me with some data, I have a couple of questions on that data. So I think about the quality of it. How is it collected? What kind of data is it? Where does it come from? I'm assuming is pretty good. And then I ask about the fidelity of it. How does it match up with my real world?
That's a good question. Yeah.
So it may be that somebody's done some projection, somebody's done some forecasting, which I think is what is in that in those spreadsheets. How have they based that on demand?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily about interpreting numbers. It's quite often about using your real world expertise to ask questions.
Right. That is very good advice. Yeah. How does it match up with your real world view of where you are? Yeah.
Yeah. And is there a gap then? Is there a gap between what they're saying and what you think is happening? And should you then explore that gap?
Yeah. Yes. And I think as far as nursing goes, that is really important, isn't it? Because you can, because as you say, we're not very good at articulating what we do, and actually not even sometimes very good at understanding fully what we do. And I'm reminded of when I was years ago, when I started my PhD, I was looking at the work by Gary Klein, who wrote a book called Sources of Power, which was actually about how firemen made decisions. And they didn't, if you ask them why they made that decision, they couldn't articulate it. It was around the same time that Patricia Benner was doing her work as well, and was finding similar things in nursing. And I think that's often still true. There's a bit of a gap between saying why we did something and what was the knowledge base. I mean, it's there, but it's articulating it, isn't it? I think that.
Yeah, there's one important difference. So there's a lot of those studies. So John Van Mannen's work on the police in the 1970s, the work in medicine. But what I find really interesting is that that level of expertise in those professions isn't ever questioned, but nursing constantly is.
Right.
So nursing constantly seems to have to justify. I mean, a lot of the things that I've shown you today would be taken as axiomatic in other safety critical industries.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have needed to do those studies in other industries.
Yes. And I wonder sometimes how much of that is because 90% of nurses are women. And, women's voices are not as authoritative traditionally. Is that, and that's, I mean, so we hear from particularly Mary Beard's research. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there is an element of that, the fact that I constantly have to explain to people who employ nurses what nursing is. Yes. I find quite concerning.
Yes, it's quite true. And in fact, when we spoke to Mary Beard about it, we were talking to her about nurses as women, because it is a big issue. And she said the public tend to think about medicine as one big thing, and doctors do most of it and nurses do the bit that's left over. And that's how it gets melded into the worldview. So our job, all of us here, all our attendees, we have to learn how to better present what we do, isn't it?
I think we have to have strong voices to help people understand why what you do is important. Yeah,
that's right. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. Yes, we're just about ready to wrap up here. I think we've reflected most of the questions, Alison, even if we didn't directly ask them. I think you've answered them through different questions, and it's just been absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you so very much for agreeing to do this with us, Alison. It's given us a huge insight, and we will let you know when we have our day of advocacy and everybody presents their requests to their ministers of health. We'll let you know.
Great. Fantastic.
Thank you so much. We do so appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. We're going to have another masterclass on advocacy. This time it'll be more on making your case. Wensher was just commented, great class shows the role of reflection in research. And I do so agree, Gwen. What came to my mind was Donald Shern's book.
Oh, yeah.
Engineering, wasn't it? reflection in practice. So lots of gratitude, lots of love from all of us, Alison. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.